I don't know how much Zoo Dresden is on the radar internationally. It's rarely mentioned in broader zoo discussions, yet in recent years the zoo has invested heavily. Most noticeable in its new Orangutan House, the largest construction project in its history. So this begs the question, should Zoo Dresden be on your radar? Is the new Orangutan House a real milestone, and how good is the zoo overall? In the following video we will take a closer look, go behind the scenes and even talk to a few people who work here. But before we get started, I really want to know now, what did you know about Zoo Dresden before watching this video? Let me know in the comments down below. And with that, let's head into this zoo review with a bit of a morning exercise, since the enclosure for the coatis can actually be seen from the forecourt even before entering the zoo through the main gate. Once inside, however, the first real highlight awaits us immediately on the left-hand side. Though while the outdoor enclosure for the mandrills are certainly well done, I'm mainly referring to the Africa house behind it. In a tropical setting, you can not only look into the netted indoor enclosure of the mandrills, which I also find relatively well done, especially in the way they use the height of the enclosure, but the building primarily serves as the indoor facility for the African elephants. This exercise area of around 1,000 square meters has existed in this form since the reopening of the building in 2018. Originally, the Africa House opened in 1999, but unfortunately the wrong type of wood was used, which couldn't withstand the tropical conditions, so it had to be renovated as early as 2015. During the 3 years of reconstruction, they took the opportunity to improve the living conditions for both the mandrills and the elephants. The visitor area was reduced in size, while the space available to the elephants was roughly doubled. In addition, elephant management was switched from direct to protected contact. This means that there is always a barrier between keepers and animals for safety reasons, even during medical training, as you can see here. Protected contact with elephants like this is already mandatory for EASA zoos, and by 2030 at the latest, all member zoos are expected to have completed the transition. The 5 indoor stalls located behind the large exercise area are of course normally not accessible to visitors, but I get to show you the high degree of flexibility they have for elephant keeping. Thanks to gates installed throughout, access can be controlled very variably at these control points. There is also a separated bull area, as well as 2 outdoor holding areas next to the main outdoor enclosure. And since the entire area is monitored by video, the elephant's behavior can be analyzed very precisely and appropriate responses can be made if necessary. All of this sounds great in theory, but how well it actually works in daily practice is something the keepers can assess much better, of course.
I have to say we're really happy. We have plenty of options to separate them or move them into different areas. Especially in winter it becomes quite difficult because of the temperatures. They can't stay outside for long periods. With the mother and calf enclosure we have over there, or the bull barn, we really have a lot of possibilities thanks to all the different stalls. And they truly have a lot of space, plenty of options and lots of enrichment.
As for the stated enrichment, there are, for example, artificial termite mounds here. Steel cables are used to pull balls filled with hay and straw up to a height of 5 meters. There are numerous logs and artificial trees. For sleeping, a sand mound is piled up, and while an indoor bathing pool was omitted in favor of a larger roaming area, there is instead a so-called rainforest shower. The elephants do, however, have a proper bathing pool in their outdoor enclosure. This covers a total of 2,800 square meters, which is certainly not huge, but it is well designed, featuring a thoughtful layout that allows contact between the bull and the females even when they are separated. Opposite the elephant enclosure lies a 500 square meter walk-through ring-tailed lemur island, which was created in a former seal pool. During my visit, however, the lemurs preferred to stay inside their indoor enclosure. Beyond the island are the historic carnivore rocks dating back to the 1910s. These are still accessible to visitors and offer good viewing points. The old carnivore cages, however, are long gone, as is the former main attraction, a 100-meter-long passageway that once allowed the big cats to move between two enclosures. Inside, the historic structures have been repurposed into a visitor experience. In addition, you can look through glass windows onto the lion enclosure. A great blend of old and new and a very engaging visitor experience, also including the indoor area on the other side of the enclosure. The structure and design of the lion enclosure are also quite solid. However, even though lions are not the big cats with the greatest need of space, I would still argue that they could definitely use more of it. In addition, the enclosure is so visually enclosed that a wide open view, something that would also be a real enrichment for lions, is simply not provided here. Next door in this netted enclosure you can also see caracals. I only recently got to show them off to you in the Zoo of Ditchin, which is not far from Dresden, but in Germany they can only be seen in 7 different zoological institutions. In terms of design, this whole area, including the small playground, is very well done and is surrounded off by the enclosure of the banded mangooses. Even though I might personally have preferred to see a smaller cat species here in the lion enclosure, such as servals for example, I have to emphasize once again, I really like how the modern enclosures have been integrated around the historic rock landscape here. Less appealing was the crumbling facade of the former aquarium and terrarium building. It was opened back in 1961 and permanently closed in 2022, with one of the reasons being the high energy costs. The building now has recently been demolished and the area will now be used as an extension to the giraffe and zebra enclosure. As a result, this giraffe enclosure from 2008 will be expanded by around 650 square meters. Compared to the condition shown here, that represents an increase of roughly 1/3. I considered it to be still acceptable even before, but adding more space here was definitely a sensible decision. In their indoor facility you can even observe the giraffes on 2 different levels, so potentially at eye level. From here you can also look outside, but as you can see there isn't really a clear, unobstructed view, and I'm not entirely sure why it was designed this way. The Giraffe House is further enhanced by a terrarium for ghost mantises and, above all, by 3 aquariums representing different freshwater habitats from Africa. Back outside, the next exhibit features a pack of dolls from Asia, which can unfortunately only be seen through a fence. Right next to it is the enclosure of the North American porcupines, which should make one thing clear: even if all the African species so far might have suggested it, Dresden Zoo is definitely not a geo-zoo. Nevertheless, this section is mostly home to Asian ungulates, more precisely Chinese gorals, West Caucasian tur, turfed deer and golden tarkins, which share their enclosure with red-crowned cranes. Aside from this particular viewing point, however, all of these enclosures can unfortunately only be seen through fences. Of historical note is the old goat house built in 1862, which is the oldest surviving building in the zoo. In fact, Dresden Zoo itself was founded only 1 year earlier in 1861 and is, after Berlin, Frankfurt and Cologne, the 4th oldest zoo in Germany. The now following bird area with its aviaries also still reflects the image of a classic urban zoo. The impressive vulture aviary here has actually been in place for over 100 years, and yet it remains a genuinely good habitat for Egyptian vultures, griffon vultures and giant eagle owls, which I unfortunately did not manage to capture on camera. The other smaller aviaries are also very nicely designed and laid out, and this aviary for smaller European bird species in particular really stood out to me. However, my personal highlight here was definitely the ibis aviary, which is built over the central canal that divides the zoo into two halves. And while there is a number of interesting species living here, if you know me, you won't be surprised that the saddle-billed storks, as pretty much always, were the real standout for me. And that brings us to the relatively new highlight here in Dresden, the new Orangutan House, which opened in June of 2024. But before I introduce the new building together with Thomas Brockman, let's first take a few steps back, look at the previous conditions and the path that eventually led to the new Orangutan House.
It was actually a very, very long journey. Our orangutans used to live in our old great ape house, which opened in 1986. At the time when it was opened, it was actually only intended as a temporary solution, because before that they were housed in the old carnivore house, where conditions were even less appropriate for the species. And so they ended up living there for about 40 years, and we waited a very long time for the opportunity to build a new orangutan house.
Yes, unfortunately that is what can happen when funding never quite comes together properly or other priorities keep getting in the way. As a result, Dresden Zoo was even awarded the negative award by the Great Ape Project in 2017 for the worst orangutan keeping conditions in Europe, which I would actually question after seeing how orangutans were kept in Ustinat-Labem until recently. But of course, it is a good thing that this almost 50-year-old provisional solution has finally come to an end. At the time of my visit, the two senior females Jaka and Judy were still living here, but they have since moved into the new house as well. The project was originally planned at around 15 million euros before COVID and the war in Ukraine, so ultimately it cost a substantial 22 million euros. Even the planning phase already attracted a lot of attention, mainly due to the unusual style and design of the construction. The building is essentially shaped like a donut, with the orangutans' outdoor enclosures located in the inner courtyard. This is partly due to a heritage-protected visitor pathway that was not allowed to be altered. At the same time, however, the layout also serves a clear animal husbandry purpose.
Rainforest species live mostly in the dense forest. Many orangutan enclosures are very open and highly exposed, but orangutans actually prefer security. We want to give them the opportunity to feel a bit more like they are in a forest, more secure. At the same time, we aim to create a microclimate that is somewhat more sheltered from wind and perhaps stays warm for longer. The walls heat up and release more temperature, which means that in winter, or at least in autumn, the animals can stay outside longer, and in spring they may be able to go outside earlier.
To what extent this concept will work in practice will only become clear over the next few years. From a visitor's perspective, the building's design also creates a very well thought out route through the exhibit. From the vulture aviary, the first thing you see is an outer enclosure for binturongs. The left-hand side of the building is entirely focused on the rainforest in general, and accordingly also houses a few other species, such as the civets from Southeast Asia mentioned earlier. A real highlight are Germany's only smooth-coated otters, which can also be observed underwater in their spacious indoor enclosure. In addition, there are several terrariums, which are also quite large, where you can discover Fiji banded iguanas, frilled lizards, giant blue-tongued skinks, or emerald tree monitors. The habitat for reticulated pythons is even a good bit larger, and it's really great to see that genuinely spacious enclosures have been created for the reptiles here. In the basement of the building, there are also a few other former terrarium inhabitants housed, which are now no longer on display for visitors. Instead, we now head back outside and across the inner courtyard, where on the right-hand side, a really great outdoor enclosure for the smooth-coated otters has been created. There is no underwater viewing here outdoors, but as you can see, the otters can still be observed beautifully both in water and on land, almost like from a boardwalk. Directly opposite, you then look through glass panels into the outdoor enclosures of the orangutans. Before my visit, I had already heard from some people that the outdoor area seemed a bit small to them. And of course, they could always be even larger, but I do not consider them too small, especially since we have to take the orangutan's natural way of life into account.
Unlike what you might know from chimpanzees or gorillas, where you mainly need a lot of ground space, for an orangutan, it is actually the volume that matters. They use lianas for climbing, and they basically use their feet like their hands. We try to simulate that by installing lots of nets and ropes in the enclosures, so that we really make use of the three-dimensional space.
And I think this aspect has been implemented very well here, especially because the ropes and nets can also be reconfigured around the artificial trees. The orangutans also not only have the otters and visitors to observe inside the building, the netted structure is also high enough that they can look outwards. And highly observant arboreal animals benefit from this greatly. In addition, the indoor enclosures also offer a very large volume, so again, not just a relatively large floor space, but above all a significant height, which not only gives the animals more space, but also allows visitors on the right-hand side of the building to observe the orangutans on 2 levels in their indoor enclosures. At the explicit request of the keepers, the enclosures are sealed off with grating, which on the one hand allows food to be thrown onto it from above, and on the other hand they are also designed to be more animal-friendly in terms of grip, so that the animals will hopefully make full use of the entire volume of their indoor enclosures. In other respects as well, this enclosure system is very much tailored for the behavior of orangutans.
Humans are very social animals. We live in groups and family structures. That is not the case for orangutans. They are rather solitary and individual animals. This needs to be addressed accordingly. So we have many small compartments that we can connect, because unlike the other great apes, orangutans do not live in large groups. That means you might keep a few together, maybe with an offspring, but the flexibility in animal management is much greater. We have 4 large indoor enclosures and 3 outdoor enclosures. Each orangutan can use any of them if they want, and we simply respond on a day-to-day basis to the animal's needs.
When you take it all together, one could already argue that this is now the best orangutan husbandry in Germany. However, the comparison with Leipzig and the amazing Pongoland is honestly quite difficult, because the outdoor enclosure there is significantly larger and also much more natural. The indoor area there has also a larger floor space, but unlike Dresden, the orangutans cannot climb all the way up under the roof. And at least in terms of flexibility, Dresden has now set new standards within Germany. By now, dusky leaf monkeys have also moved in, and such mixed species exhibits can add even more variety to the daily life of zoo animals. All in all, I really have nothing to complain about when it comes to animal husbandry in this building, especially since the final animal living here, the Aldabra giant tortoises, have a nice enclosure as well. Overall, I think the Orangutan House turned out really good, Behind the scenes, the zookeeper areas also appear to be very good workplaces, and in the visitor area I really like the rather minimalist architecture and design, which, especially through the dark coloring of the walls, clearly puts the focus on the animal areas and makes them stand out even more. In addition, I really appreciate the educational elements. Like I said, the left-hand side is generally about the rainforest habitat, while the right-hand side naturally focuses on the orangutans. You can learn about their way of life, what threatens them and their habitat, how Dresden Zoo is trying to help, but also what you as a private individual can do. Visually, everything is on an excellent level that, in my opinion, is not far behind the Darwinium or Polarium in Rostock, which is top tier. So yeah, I really like the Orangutan House and its concept. It's also fully accessible, which honestly should be the norm for every new building, of course. So yeah, if you ask me, the 22 million euros in construction costs were expensive, but worth it. Before the new Orangutan House, the zoo's most expensive construction project was the Professor Brandes House, which opened in 2010. It is named after a former zoo director and was designed as a tropical house, home to more than 20 species from Asia, South America and Africa. Since 2013, however, koalas have also been kept here. They can now also be found in Leipzig and Stuttgart, but if we disregard a 6-month loan to Berlin Tierpark, Dresden was the second zoo in Germany after Duisburg where these cute Australians could be seen. Otherwise, the house is home to various primate species. Giraffes are even the heraldic animal of Dresden Zoo and have been featured in its logo since 1986. In addition to the African species, there are also lion-tailed macaques from Asia and several New World monkeys, including white-faced sakis, red howler monkeys, and emperor tamarins. Among others, there are also crowned lemurs, various bird species, and armadillos. Unfortunately, I did not get to see the tamanduras here, so instead I will show you some footage from Stuttgart. There are also a whole series of small terrariums. The sloths can move freely throughout much of the building, and in the dense undergrowth you can spot crested partridge. In this crocodile enclosure, a real zoo personality lived until 2015, Max, the saltwater crocodile. After his death, the enclosure is now home to a false gharial. So as you can see, the house is quite species-rich. But I also really like the building architecturally. Even if it's not fully immersive like a tropical hall with dense planting everywhere, in my opinion it still does enough to create a fitting atmosphere. And when it comes to animal husbandry, the indoor enclosures for the primates in particular are pretty convincing, especially because the vertical space is once again fully utilized. Covering a total area of 1.3 hectares, on one side there are 3 beautifully designed monkey islands, home to the lion-tailed macaques, howler monkeys and giraffes, while emperor tamarins, sakis and others have outdoor aviaries on the other side. Opposite the monkey islands is this somewhat less appealing enclosure for yellow-throated martens. I did not see them here, but I have been to enough zoos to just show you some footage from somewhere else. Their enclosure here in Dresden used to be the old snow leopard exhibit, so it's a good thing that in 2010 they could move in a much bigger and quite beautiful enclosure. Although I've been told you can rarely see them here, and unfortunately I cannot prove otherwise. At the Penguin Cafe, however, there was actually something to see again. Penguins. Who would have guessed? Here you can definitely get very close to them, and there is also a small underwater viewing area. Next up are the cheetahs, which roam their enclosure right along the fence. As a result, you can get very close to them as well. Their enclosure is, to be honest, not particularly spectacular, but definitely solid. And more or less the same can be said about the cattle enclosures that follow. Watusi cattle, banteng and African forest buffaloes are kept here in very classic city zoo exhibits, and honestly I think that still has a certain charm. Then I was at least able to catch a brief glimpse at the red panda before it disappeared back into the dense vegetation of its very lushly designed enclosure. The bat-eared foxes remained completely relaxed, while as always there was plenty of action at the meerkat enclosure. And I have to say, these crowd favorites really do live in a very nicely designed habitat here. There is also a large petting zoo area, a pony paddock, and additional ungulate enclosures for hog deer, nilgai, and Bactrian camels. Everything is very classic, but especially thanks to the dry modes, it's still nice to look at. You should not miss the entrance to the so-called zoo beneath the earth. Here you can see mice and rats, but also various little crawlers and newts, all presented in a very atmospherically designed area that truly takes you underground. Back in daylight, the path leads us now back to the central canal, which is home to various waterfowl and, above all, pelicans. Another highlight is the walk through Flamingo Aviary, which is also home to scarlet ibises and roseate spoonbills. The main attraction here, however, are of course the Cuban flamingos. Their old enclosure had to make way for the new Orangutan House, but at this new location a truly beautiful overnetted waterscape was created across a total area of 1,550 square meters, and I think it's great, both as a habitat for the animals and as a visitor experience. In this part of the zoo there are also several other aviaries, such as this one for grey-crowned cranes, or a macaque aviary which houses somewhat less commonly seen species like red-fronted macaques or blue-throated macaques. The greatest rarity, however, is the long-tailed fiscal, which can now be seen in no other zoo in Europe. Also worth mentioning is the interesting mixed exhibit for rock hyraxes and eastern yellow-billed hornbills. In another ungulate enclosure you will find the beautiful nyalas, there's also an enclosure for red kangaroos, and finally a South America exhibit for vicuñas, rheas and maras. This is another good example of how heritage protection can sometimes limit the development of zoos, because yes, this small, rather inconspicuous wall is actually protected. Unfortunately, the zoo's rich history is now only truly tangible in a few places. The reason for that is of course mainly the destruction in World War II. Nevertheless, even today it is clear that Dresden Zoo, with its layout and park-like setting, still has the feel of a classic city zoo. Saxony of course has also Leipzig Zoo, which is considered to be one of the best zoos in Germany, if not the best. And yes, it's far more spectacular in comparison with its almost complete modernization, but I actually think Dresden Zoo offers a very nice contrast with its more traditional zoo experience. And yes, there are a few enclosures here that are not particularly impressive and appear rather simple, but considering that on just 13 hectares, the zoo still has over 200 animal species, including some large animals, animal husbandry standards are at least solid throughout. Because apart from the lions perhaps, the available space is used really well. And the Orangutan House is not just another highlight, in my opinion it really elevates Dresden Zoo to a new level. I also really like the Professor Brandes house, and after its modernization the Africa House is really nice as well. There are many smaller highlights too, such as the Flamingo Aviary or perhaps the snow leopard enclosure. So all in all, I can recommend a visit here. But what do you think? Feel free to share your opinion on Dresden Zoo or specifically the Orangutan House in the comments. Of course, I'm also very thankful for a like, hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks to Thomas and Dresden Zoo as a whole for the hospitality. And with that being said, take care, see you soon, auf Wiedersehen, yours truly, Martin.
But orangutans... Scheiße, was ist das für ein Wort, Mann?